It's been an emotional and devastating day for the country. The 21 teens who died at the eNCA Tavern in East London were buried at a mass funeral service, and the death of a loved one can be unimaginably challenging. To discuss how parents can be helped to navigate this indescribable pain, we chat to clinical psychologist Viwe Dweba. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Viwe. As I've mentioned in my intro, it's an unimaginable situation that a parent would find themselves in when their child dies suddenly. There was no illness, there was no precursor to the passing away of that child. It just happens, and then it's difficult for any parents to reconcile.
Absolutely. I think that, what you were saying earlier about it being an absolutely unimaginable tragedy is completely accurate. And I think that trying to make sense of it, trying to put into words what it is that's been experienced by these parents is something that, is something that I don't think we can actually do. And that can be difficult for us to sit with. It can be difficult for us to sit with the senselessness of the loss of children. I think it's especially tragic when we lose our children. And these parents are going to be struggling for a long time, looking for answers, which is a very natural part of this process, especially where there's been tragedy. Answers are always sought. And of course, the great deal of guilt that these parents are going to be struggling with, because of course, as parents, there's this incredible responsibility to care for our children. And when something has happened, when something really unfortunate, such as this has happened, there will, of course, be a great deal of feelings of guilt from all these parents.
And I suppose it's important to understand, before we get into healing or coping mechanisms, Viwe, that parents will learn to live with the situation, but it never actually leaves them. It's not something that they can completely move on from. It remains with them, and they do learn to just live with the tragedy.
Absolutely. I think that this is often a misconception we have about grief. That grief will over time get better and then completely dissipate. And that's really not the case. We learn to live with our grief. And of course, it won't hit as hard as it did on day one, but it'll never be okay that a person is gone, and that pain is unimaginable. One of the most painful and traumatic experiences that we have as human beings is the loss of a child.
So what about those coping mechanisms then? I mean, it's very difficult to tell someone what to do or how to deal with a situation when they are still so traumatized by the events that have taken place. But what are the initial things that one could start to consider doing as they start to pick up the pieces?
So I think an important thing is about making room for grief. So it's about understanding not only of the parents themselves, but the family members and friends of the parents, to understand that there is nothing that can be said, there is nothing that can be done to make this loss any better, and that grief needs to follow its natural course. And that necessarily means that there will be pain, there will be despair, and often there'll be suicidal thoughts because one wishes to join their child. And that's really what those thoughts are about. So it's about allowing room for the incredible well of grief. That is the very first thing. And as human beings, especially when we care about people, we're primed towards wanting to fix. And we can't fix this. So I think the most important thing is about making room for the grief process. The most important thing is the support of those around them. And by support, I mean not trying to fix, but only allowing there to be a safe space where these parents can grieve.
What about the resources, Viwe? We speak all the time when it comes to mental health issues, for example, that the resources and the access to affordable mental health care or grief counseling is not easily or readily available, particularly in communities like the one we are seeing in East London. How do parents expose themselves to the different resources and in some instances affordable resources, because some of them may not have the financing to get the counseling that they need?
Oh, absolutely. Accessing mental health care in our country is incredibly difficult. It is a privilege to be able to do so, which is not something that shouldn't be the case, but this is where we are in this moment. So organizations such as SADAG, also Lifeline and FAMSA do offer counseling services. If my understanding is correct with FAMSA, it's on a sliding scale in terms of what someone can afford. Lifeline has telephone services as well. And I know that because East London's my hometown, I know in Southernwood specifically, there is a Lifeline, there are Lifeline offices. And there's also SADAG that does offer both in-person and telephone services 24 hours a day. There are dedicated suicide lines. So those will be very important resources for these parents. But I think something that is really important, if schools have the capacity to do so, is to see if even group debriefings can be possible at some point, where you have parents of the bereaved parents sort of meeting together and having a safe space where they can support each other in this senselessness, because there is nothing that is quite as lonely as grieving. And if we can grieve in a space together, that can be something that's really supportive.
I know our focus is on the grieving parents at this stage, Viwe, but we cannot forget about the siblings or the schoolmates of those that have passed away. How do young people, children, navigate grief at this time? We've just spoken about the parental aspect of it, but for maybe the siblings that have now been left behind by their brothers or sisters or some schoolmates, how do they even begin to make sense of what's happened?
So this is where I think the adults around these children become very important. So school teachers, if there are churches that children are in, sort of religious leadership to make spaces for children, to allow there to be support and perhaps even pastoral counseling, but some sort of debriefing space. Children are likely to be, I think what you were saying is very important, and sort of alluding at the fact that children can get forgotten, especially where there is, a bereaved set of parents, bereaved parent. The surviving children can often get lost in the magnitude of that grief. So I think it's also important to pay attention to the children. And if teachers can also do this, and I also understand that our teachers are carrying something very heavy as well. It's going to be important for them to also sort of have a role in how these children move forward, in addition to extended family. And some of the things that need to be looked out for, especially with the children who are particularly close to those who have passed away and those who may have been in the area or who were in there and then left earlier. It's important to look for things like survivor's guilt. It's important to look for an increase in anxiety. And also there will be a lot of trauma with the children who have survived. So it'll be very important to look out for those. And where there are children, I do reiterate that it's important for the grown-ups around the kids to really step in for them.
Thank you very much. Very, very important insights there from a clinical psychologist, Viwe Dweba, breaking down how parents even begin to navigate the tragedy that they've just experienced, but also not forgetting that there are children that are still left behind and they must not be forgotten as well.